And we're going to share the screen. Sorry, give me a minute here. I only have one screen, so I have to do something tricky. Okay. All right, everyone. So here's our roadmap for class today, our first class. I'm going to lead this first session on understanding NOGAs, just-in-time processes, and other support documents. Then we'll have a quick break, and then we'll have 2 more sessions on monitoring sponsored programs and indirect costing principles. So we are going to get started here. Let me make sure I can see my notes. Okay. If you have any questions throughout class, please put them in the chat and there'll be time for questions as we go through here. And there's a lot of content to cover. So if I'm moving too quickly or anything, please don't hesitate to ask a question in the chat. Sorry, I'm trying to make sure that the camera here is okay. Oh, wait, no, that's blocking. Whatever. Okay, that's fine. All right. So if you participate in game part 1, you'll remember that we discussed the grant life cycle, kind of the steps as you move through a grant. So game part 1 covered pre-award activities, and game part 2 is going to cover post-award activities. And if you did not participate in game part 1, all of the slides and the video recordings are still on our website, so you can go back and watch those at any point. And this is what we'll cover in the first session today. And we're kind of in this stage of the grant life cycle, award acceptance. And we're going to start with the just-in-time process. This session today is focusing on National Institutes of Health, NIH grants. However, as you guys know, there are many different funders. They all have different methods of getting to a point where you accept a grant award. So please keep this in mind. And we're going to kick off with a poll question. Have you or your organization submitted an NIH just-in-time request? And you may not even know what that is. That's okay. Just answer to the best of your knowledge. I'm going to launch our poll here. So you should see that pop up. This is a good test of making sure we know how to answer a poll question. All right, we've got a good mix of responses right now. Perfect. So we had 3 people say yes, they've submitted it as the prime awardee. Congratulations. That means that you've gotten a grant directly to your organization. Yes, as a subcontract, a few of you. Some of you said no, and then most of you said, I don't know. And that's okay. We're going to talk about what a JIT is, and then you'll know. So after you submit a grant, there is a waiting period before the review takes place, and then before you find out about the funding. And this is just a reminder that ERA Commons is NIH's grant portal system. You'll be able to see your submitted application in ERA Commons. Once the grant gets reviewed, you can see the outcome of your review. If funding is likely, then you'll submit your just-in-time request through there. And then if you get funded, you'll also be able to see your NOGA in ERA Commons. So it's a great tool and very useful for all things NIH. So funders may request items after a grant is submitted, but before the award is made. And this is what NIH calls a just-in-time request, or it's an acronym, JIT request. So after the initial grant review for applications that have overall impact scores of 30 or less, NIH will send an automatic email requesting JIT information. However, specific institute that you submitted your grant to, so for example, maybe your project was about infectious diseases, so you submitted it to the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. They're going to have a pay line or the score for which funding is certain. And you should double check what the pay line is for your specific institute before you prepare JIT documents. If funding is likely, you'll get a JIT request directly from that institute, and that is the most important request. A JIT, unfortunately, does not guarantee your proposal will be funded until NIH is satisfied that your application meets all of the requirements and that you provide that information. They will not make the award. And so here's an example, as I mentioned, of NIAID's pay lines currently. So for an R01 application with a non-new PI, you need to score within the 11th percentile in order to be sure that you are getting funded. And you'll see the pay line is different for different grants. Some of them, it kind of depends on the types of applications that they receive, the number of applications they receive. You'll see down here for these R03 smaller grants, you need to get a 28 overall impact score or a 22 overall impact score. And so if you fall within that score range, you can be pretty sure that you'll get funded. However, if you score a little bit above that, you still might get funded. It just depends on how much money they have available. So what is NIH looking for in a JIT? They're checking that there's sufficient levels of effort that are committed to the project. They're checking to make sure there's no scientific, budgetary, or commitment overlap listed in your application. And I put the definition of those 3 types of overlap right there. We did go over these in GAIN Part 1, so I'm not gonna reiterate, but just a refresher for those who did not participate. And NIH they do not allow overlap, including commitment of an individual's effort greater than 100% time. And so they'll make sure that that overlap issue is resolved before they make the award. They're also checking to see that only the funds necessary to the approved project are included in the award. And that if your site, for example, if you've included an international component, that you've included that prior to your award making and that it's been appropriately approved. And here are the things that they ask for when they send you a JIT. The most important and personally the most time-consuming piece is current other support documents. So they'll require these for all senior key personnel in your application. And we'll talk a little bit more about other support in the next session. They also ask for some different certifications. If you have human subjects research, they'll ask for your IRB approval. If you have animal research, they'll ask for your, I always hit it, IACUC approval. Yeah, I never know how to say that. I don't work with animals. So. You'll need to provide proof of human subjects education for anyone, any key personnel involved in human subjects education. And then there's some very specific project related things about human embryonic stem cells, if you're using those. If you're having genomic data, you'll have to create and send a certificate for sharing genomic data. And then they may ask for other kind of case-by-case items, maybe a revised budget, changes to a certain section of your application, maybe your IDC FNA rate agreement, something like that. And so I thought for this first activity, we would just go through a real JIT request that I have received. But I just want to make a note before I do that, that JIT requests often have really tight deadlines. So if you think your application will be funded, you should start pulling together the documents sooner rather than later for these requests. It takes some time to gather up all the pieces. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing this screen. And now we're going to do this screen. Can you see this? Yes. Thanks. Okay, so this first JIT request, this is the automated one that you'll get if you scored an 30 or less. But just because you get this does not mean you'll be funded, sadly. We received one of these automated ones recently, and sadly, our application did not get funded. We didn't meet the score. So just note that. I know it's exciting to get something like this, but you'll need to check your score and the pay line. So this goes through that list that I just provided to you and with some detailed instructions. So they'll ask for the current other support, like I mentioned, all of those certifications that we just talked about, if they approve or if they apply to your project. Most of that won't apply to you guys. This is for small businesses. And I think most of you work at nonprofits or academic institutions. And then, like I said, they may request other information. So this is just the blanket standard email that you'll get. And then here is one that was more specific. So this was sent afterwards. And this one we did respond to, and we were pretty sure that our application was going to get funded this time. So some of the things are the same, but now it's going to be specific to your grant. Other support, IRB approval. This project had human subjects. This JIT request had an interesting statement just confirming that we'd met the Brazilian Ethics Committee approval. So my Brazilian colleagues will know CONEP very well. And so we just had to confirm that, yes, we have received this approval with the Brazilian government. They wanted the human subjects education certificates, like we mentioned. And then just to confirm our entity number and our FNA rate agreement. So this was a pretty standard one. And as you can see, they asked for it by May 2nd, and they sent it on April 24th. So they don't give you a lot of time. You have to pull this stuff together pretty fast. And here's one more example. This one was more extensive, so I thought it was also a good example. Some of these are the same: other support, IRB approval, human subjects education. So for this application, they cut our budget drastically. And so they asked us for a few things related to that. They wanted a detailed response of the summary statement. So those are the comments that the reviewers provide. They wanted us to respond to that summary statement. They wanted a list of all the international sites participating in the project. And then they asked us for an updated budget. So we had to send a revised budget. And these were just some considerations that they wanted us to make sure that we knew. And lastly, because we had to cut our budget so much, if you cut your budget, you may not be able to accomplish the same amount of work that you proposed in your original application. And so they asked us for updated specific aims to reflect that budget cut. Okay, so those are some JIT examples. And ooh, the sun is shining on my face, kind of weird. Okay.
Hillary, I think you put this on your slide, but I just wanted to reiterate for everyone that these types of documents that we go through will all be made available to everyone. So if you want, more time to really look at what an example of a just-in-time request looks like, you'll have access to all of this.
Thank you, Anne. Yes, they'll all get posted to our website. Okay, so I put a few more resources, links to the NIH website about just-in-time procedures in case you get one or you have questions. And that brings us to the end of this first topic. Does anyone have any questions about JITs?
Feel free to raise a hand or put a question in the chat or just speak up with your question. Okay, I have one question. Can you request an extension to a JIT deadline date? That's a good question.
I think you can, Renee. I would request an opinion from your authorized signing official. We have certainly requested extensions if for a good reason. I think just like not having enough time is maybe not a great reason, but if you say, hey, we needed another support from this faculty member and they are out of town for 2 weeks, or I think with a valid reason, it's okay to request an extension.
I have a quick question in relation to, you mentioned sharing the IRB approval. And so I wonder if you could just speak quickly to the timeline of how that plays out when you prepare a grant application. We've already covered all the pre-award. At what point are you submitting your IRB application in this timeline?
That's a great question, Anne, and something I don't know if we've figured out 100%, but you're not getting you aren't certain of funding until you get a JIT request, and then all of a sudden they're asking for IRB approval. At Vanderbilt, what we have done is submit what they call an umbrella IRB. And so that's kind of just submitting your grant application to the IRB, and they'll send you like a provisional approval letter, and we'll often use that as our IRB approval that'll meet the needs of the JIT requirement. And then later we'll have to get more specific, maybe international site level IRB approval or something additional at Vanderbilt. I don't know if anyone else has experiences doing something different. Also, I think sometimes if you have a project that builds off of another one, you can amend an existing IRB. So let's say you're using a data set from an existing approved IRB, you may be able to amend that IRB to get approval quicker than if you were going to submit a new one. Those are my experiences. I don't know if anyone else has other experiences.
We have a few questions. Leonard asks, in case some of the certificate or documents requested are not applicable in your country, what do you do? Leonard, I don't know if you have a specific example.
I think you can just tell them that, Leonard. I would say if there's a file that's not applicable, then I would just tell them that this file is not applicable. It's possible maybe that you just haven't created that file yet for your institution. That's something that we could help with. Also, we have plenty of template documents available. I would say one of those two options.
And then Awal asks, could inability to answer the questions in JIT result to non-funding?
Potentially, as I mentioned, NIH won't make an award until they're satisfied with the responses from a JIT request. So let's say that there's significant budgetary or effort overlap in a proposal and neither you nor NIH can resolve the issue. That might hold up an award or lead to a non-funded proposal. So it is important to make sure that you can answer the questions, at least to the best of your ability. So great questions, you guys. Thank you. Okay, great. We're going to move on to our next section, which is other support, one of the key components of a just-in-time request. So as I mentioned a few minutes ago, NIH wants to make sure there's no overlap between your proposal, between the budget, between effort for an investigator, and other support documents are the primary way that they assess whether or not there's overlap. So we discussed other support pretty heavily in GAIN Part 1. Excuse me. But since the new other support format went into effect in January and we had GAIN Part 1 in November, we just want to do a quick review since everyone has now been working with this new format. And of course, you can access the GAIN Part 1 slides on the website if you want to go back and do a deeper dive into other support. So other support documents are used for JIT requests and for our PPRs, progress reports to NIH. It includes information about the active and pending grant support for an investigator. And the goal is to avoid overlap and ensure that we're being transparent with NIH about our funding commitments. And all senior key personnel need to submit an other support document, except program directors and training faculty on training grants, other significant contributors. Mostly other significant contributors are people with no effort dedicated to the project. They're listed on the application, but they don't have measurable effort. And if you had no changes at the time of a progress report, you don't need to submit an updated document. And other support files should contain all resources available to a researcher in support of research. So those are any resources and financial support, mostly dedicated effort. That's what that's talking about. They want to see both international and domestic US sources of support. It could include some personnel support, lab or clinical provisions. Maybe you have a consulting agreement that includes research, and any in-kind contributions supported by an outside source, which could include office, lab space, equipment, supplies, and personnel. And as I mentioned, the new format went into effect January of this year. And there are a few changes, which I've reiterated here, that it only needs to include current and pending support. It must have an electronic signature. NIH wants to make sure that the investigator reviewed the file, agreed with it, and then signed it. You need now need to include contracts or copies, copies of your contracts for any foreign employment. And if it's in a different language, they ask that you include the English translation. And then in each project, you now list total costs for the entire project period. However, if you're a subaward, you can just list the total amount going to your subaward. Okay, so I hope that some of you have been creating this new format, or at least looking at the new formatted documents, and we're going to play a little game. So we are going to, you're going to join a breakout group. I'm going to split you into 3 different teams, and you're going to go to the website, and under class 1, there are 2 activity files, and you want to open up this first file, which is called Other Support Game. And you'll go through the file with your team and count as many issues that you can find. And if you want to mark them in a highlight or in a different font color so that then you can go back and count them later, that might be a good idea. And the team that finds the most errors wins. So I'm going to stop sharing this. And so let me put the website link again in the chat. So click on the website, find class 1, and then download the Other Support Game file. And I'm going to create the breakout rooms. Okay, I hope everyone found the file. Did anyone have any problems? Do they need help before we go to our breakout rooms? Okay, hopefully you found it. Okay, I'm opening up the rooms. So with your team, count how many errors you can find in the file. Oh, thanks, Jaime.
Jill, are we to go in rooms?
It's up to you. It automatically put you in one if you want to join one. See, there's a few of you guys who haven't joined your breakout room yet. Let me know if you're having issues.
As well as a professional development series called VPRAD, and that stands for the Vanderbilt Program for Research Administration Development. So I am going to share my screen so we can get started here. All right. Can you guys see that? Okay, good. So the topic that I'm going to talk with you guys today is around monitoring of sponsored programs. So I'm going to walk through some of the various responsibilities you may have as a research administrator for monitoring those sponsored programs that you have with the US government. So when we think about our responsibilities as research administrators, your day-to-day activities or the tasks that you have may be divided up across these 5 buckets. You may only touch 1 or 2 of these, depending on your role. But the 5 categories that we've identified are financial, program and lab, grants and contracts, safety and compliance, and regulatory. So for the purpose of today's conversation, I'm going to focus on financial research administrative responsibilities, along with some compliance and a little bit of regulatory. So just know that this presentation today isn't all encompassing, but we're going to hit some of the high points for you. In your roles as an administrator, you work closely with your research teams, your investigators, to partner to assist them so that their time can be spent on the research activities that they are highly qualified for, and they have to spend less time focused on administrative tasks that you all are probably more qualified to handle. So these tasks can come in lots of different areas, questions, responsibilities, and activities. So they could be in the HR spectrum. So could be payroll type questions, onboarding, offboarding team members. You may get questions about those types of activities. They could also be financial in nature. So they could be around procurement or purchasing of items for your research projects, could be around travel on your research projects, or they could just be compliance related topics, perhaps working with other institutions, other areas within your own institution, and the support structure that you have. It's important to note as a research administrator, your responsibility is to balance the support of the administrative task for your researchers while also balancing compliance for your institution, right? So you really do wear 2 hats. You have to make sure that you're assisting and taking care of the tasks that are asked of you by your investigators, but also making sure that you're maintaining compliance both with your own institutional standards as well as for today's purpose, we're talking about US government awards. So making sure you're staying in compliance with the rules around those awards, which could be very different than the other types of awards that you may have within your research portfolio. So the point down here at the bottom right around communication being key really is critical. And I hope this is already part of your best practice, but if not, could be a great takeaway for you is to set up some regular meetings with your investigators. At VUMC, we recommend as a best practice monthly meetings where you can have a department meeting where some of these types of topics can be discussed. Things like projects ending, projects beginning, new staff members coming on board, new staff members leaving, the amount of time that's being spent on one project or the other, perhaps key items that need to be purchased where there's a longer lead time, something to that effect. You have regular communications where these topics are discussed. If they're in a formal meeting, they can be documented with meeting notes, action items can be recorded, followed up on, keeps everyone on the same page and gets you as an administrator thinking in a more proactive mindset. It's much easier to handle your responsibilities as an administrator if you know about things before they happen rather than after the fact, right? We got a new project on board and you just now found out about it as an administrator. Not the ideal scenario. Somebody left the institution and somebody else has been working on this project. Not the ideal scenario. So having that proactive communication really is a critical step and a great best practice. As a research administrator, we touched on the 5 categories a couple slides back, but you're juggling a lot of things. I know for the folks that come to a lot of my classes, research administration is just one element of their job. Their job title isn't research administrator, right? This is more of activities or responsibilities that they have to get complete on a daily or weekly basis, but you're juggling a lot of things from support, phone calls, helping get new award perhaps submitted out the door, closing out projects, maintaining your existing portfolio, as well as any other basic job responsibilities that you have. So you're juggling a lot. And I want us to think a little bit about some of those responsibilities that you have in your current role. And so if you guys are comfortable coming off mute and just sharing a couple of your research administrative responsibilities, or if you want to enter them into the chat, that works as well. Can get my chat box, not sure where that went, but I'll figure out. What are some of the research administrative responsibilities that you all have currently? Contracts and compliance for sure. Yes, definitely responsibilities around managing of contracts, and then specifically the compliance aspect to that.
I know many of you are involved in invoicing and compiling and sending invoices as a subcontract, as a contractor.
Yeah, invoicing is
Financial,
definitely.
I know a lot of you have a lot of financial responsibilities.
What are those financial responsibilities?
Well, helping with support documents.
Yeah, support documentation for sure. Helping put that together and compile that, store it, file it. Anyone else? Okay, so I put together, oh, go ahead.
Putting together expense reports for donors.
Yeah, exactly. Expense reports, audits, inspections, travel reports. You guys are hitting a lot of the lists that I put together. New proposal applications for sure. The new business development. So you guys hit on some of these already. Compliance for sure, right? We're wearing that compliance hat on a daily basis, helping keep your institution in compliance. But what about managing your budgets? Nobody mentioned that in our brief kind of sharing of responsibilities, but you've got a budget from your sponsor. You know where you can spend, where you perhaps can't spend, and are you in compliance with managing your budget? Purchasing of items. I'm guessing some of you are involved in that process, whether it's lab supplies, medical supplies, even office supplies in some cases, but buying things for your research projects. Depending on the type of work that you have, you may be involved in patient recruiting for clinical trials, also data management. You know, the data that we're collecting as part of our research, how is that being compiled? Which systems or tools are you using for that? What are the deliverables that are due to various groups as part of that responsibility? There's also things like lab management. Some of you may be more involved in the specific research that's taking place in the lab, so you may have a closer tie to that work, and so you're wearing that hat as well. Monthly reconciliation, right? That came up, I believe, or perhaps it didn't, but reconciliation is an important piece of your financial responsibilities to ensure that what you're charging to your U.S. government grants and contracts is appropriate, and the expenditures that are on those awards are in fact should be included on those particular awards. Managing of personnel is a big thing when we think about our research administrative responsibilities, both in at VUMC, we spend more money on our people than on anything else. So our salary expenses and the benefits, the fringe benefits that come along with our employees are 60 to 70% of most of our research project budgets. So managing your personnel is an important piece of managing your budget. If you're overspent in your personnel or your salary expenses, it's really difficult to get back in your spending into control to manage your overall budget. And then also closeouts, right? I'll touch on closeouts. I'm a little later in this presentation, but I'll be back later in your program to talk some more about closeouts with you all, but that's another important piece of your research administration responsibilities. And every time I talk to folks about closeouts or even have it as a word on a slide, I will encourage you all to prepare for closeouts today, as opposed to waiting until that short period of time at the end of your project to complete the closeout process. So preparing for closeouts as you're going through expending or spending money on your projects is a great best practice. And the last point that I have is one that very, very rarely gets mentioned when folks are talking about their research administrative responsibilities, and that's internal controls, right? And as a research administrator, as we're balancing that act of administrative support for our researchers and compliance for our institution, it's really important that we understand the internal controls that are in place around us and help monitor and manage those internal controls. So internal controls, to define them at a simple level, is internal controls can be policies, they could be procedures, or they could be best practices. It doesn't have to be one or the other. It could be any of those, but they are structures or processes that are put in place to help your organization achieve an objective. Okay, so you're trying to achieve an objective, and we've got a procedure or a best practice or a policy in place to help us achieve that objective. We have internal controls to help us protect our assets. So as an institution, we have very valuable assets like you all. These could be things like our buildings, our data, our really expensive equipment that's used in our research labs. It also, though, includes our reputation. And so at Vanderbilt, we're known for the high quality education that we provide, the advanced biomedical research that we conduct, as well as the high quality patient care that we provide. And so maintaining that reputation is very important to us as an institution. So we put in place internal controls to help us protect our assets. And so when we think about what that could look like, it could be things like having a login to access our system and our data, right? It's behind a firewall. And so that data is protected, so not everyone could get to that data. Could also be having ID badges that you have to scan to get into certain research labs, or so that we can even know who one another are at a large institution. It can be tricky for us. So we have various internal controls that surround us, that become part of our culture, part of our daily activities, that are designed to help us protect our assets. We also want to ensure that our records are accurate. This is very important for us in the research space as we're trying to make advances in the research that we're conducting. Our sponsors require or want to see our access to our records, but we also make business decisions at our medical center based off of the records and the reporting that we produce as a finance department, as an organization. So this could be things like entering into an agreements with other institutions like those that you all work with, based off of the records and the data that's provided to us. Could be business decisions that are made at the medical center, whether that's expanding the children's hospital and adding on new floors to that building, or opening up new clinics across the region, or partnering or purchasing additional hospitals. We have internal controls in place to ensure that our records are accurate so that we can make informed business decisions. We also want to promote operational efficiency. And I'm guessing this is a goal for many of your institutions as well. We're trying to do as much as we can with the limited resources that we have, whether those are hours in the day or dollars in a checking account. We're trying to do as much as possible to contribute to our mission. And we are promoting operational efficiency with our internal controls, in that we are not trying to design a system or process or policies that are so onerous that they consume your day-to-day activities. Instead, we want to build our internal controls in a manner that incorporate and can be easily included into your day-to-day activities, into your culture of your organization. And so we're promoting operational efficiency through our internal controls. In addition, we want to make sure we're in compliance. We want to adhere to all policies, procedures. For today's topic, that could be the US government awards, could be your own institutional policies, could be your country's policies or rules around the research that's taking place. But we want to make sure we're in compliance. And so we have internal controls to help us achieve those 4 things. And it's important for you all as research administrators and leaders in your organization to embrace the internal controls that you have in your area. You want to embody the internal controls. You want to talk about the internal controls, right? So it's a good best practice or recommendation to talk about the internal controls that you have in a staff meeting, in a one-on-one with your team members, to review and inspect to make sure that the internal controls are being met and followed. If you have a best practice around, I'll say, putting a business purpose on all of your lab supply orders to justify why you're buying this item for this award, go in and review some of those purchase orders, some of those transactions to make sure that business purpose field is being filled out. Talking about this and setting the tone at your level increases the likelihood that internal controls will be important for your organization. And as research administrators, this is critical for compliance. Not one person, not one office can manage or maintain compliance for your institution. It really is a team. Everyone plays a role in this. And so you as leaders have your influence that you can contribute to help creating that culture of compliance at your organization. What questions do you guys have here so far about internal controls? Can you guys think of any internal controls that you have as part of your organizations, perhaps that could be shared out with the group here? Something that may be unique or something that you've seen that's really helped address an issue, or maybe an area where there was a risk?
Yeah, one of the internal controls is that every payment must have to go through the internal audit of the hospital or the research facility, and that has to be approved.
Yeah, so you guys have a central office then that reviews all of the payments that are going out, it sounds like, for the research community? That's very beneficial, I would assume, in helping get multiple sets of eyes, multiple people reviewing those transactions, perhaps from different areas, almost a third-party view of the transaction. Yeah, I can definitely see that being beneficial. Anyone else have it's like all purchases relating to the project must be approved by the program manager and management accounting. Yeah, that's great. So you have leadership approval of all of the purchases for your research projects. Yeah, that's a great internal control. I'm actually going to talk about that in just maybe the next slide. So it's a great segue. Anybody else have anything else here around?
So do we define the internal control as just a method to ensure prudential activity generally? Prudence.
Yeah, so internal controls can be all around you, right? So from a financial standpoint, it's definitely going to show the prudent nature of the purchase, that the expenditure is appropriate for the research project. But some internal controls that are probably in place around you that you don't necessarily even think about could be things like, in our office, we had a code to print. So you had to print your item, then go to the printer, put a code in, and then your thing would print out. That just protected that information that you were printing from showing up on the printer and somebody getting access to information that they shouldn't have. It could be something like if a patient is going in to have a knee replacement surgery, the surgeon can mark on their knee which knee the surgery is going to take place on, right? So that there's no question they're going to operate on Mark's right knee. And because he's got a pin mark circled with an arrow pointing there, that's the knee that's going to be operated on. That's an internal control designed to limit the risk to the institution so that there's no chance or there's a much smaller chance that procedure would take place on the wrong part of the body.
And we do acknowledge that, every institution has a varying degree of internal controls. And part of what we're trying to do here with GAIN is learn more from each other on how we can enhance our internal controls and compliance and that sort of thing. So we know it's a work in progress, and kind of just assessing your own context and seeing where there might be gaps and room for improvement is a part of that process.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, because we think about internal controls and we often think about these are institutional policies or these are US government rules. And yes, those are both can be internal controls, but these can also be done at a department level within your own team. What are the rules that you have around, managing your staffing levels? How do people request time off? How do you document and record the time off? Is it in a Outlook calendar? Do you have a third-party system that you're using to request and approve and track that? So they can be controlled at a granular level, and it can simply be a best practice, something that you do in your area to meet the need or to achieve an objective, to help maintain compliance for your institution. Any other thoughts or questions here before segue into the next section?
So
Hi.
in terms of some internal controls here at the University of Liberia, the College of Health Sciences, we have physical control in with assets or equipment that we buy for the office use. So there's a whole system where when the vendor delivers the item, it doesn't come directly to the procurement unit. It has to go to a separate office, the office of the executive assistant for the VP. That's the executive assistant to Dr. Dan's office. So from there, the need department will go to that office to sign for that asset, either equipment or something for the office use. So, and then there's a form that is filled out from the need department that they receive this item that they requested initially from that office, and that form is in turn delivered to the procurement team, that they are aware that yes, we requested this item, it was delivered to the office, and the need department is in the know, or they have received the item. So that fiscal control of how we do our procurement and receiving entities, how we receive goods that are purchased.
Yeah, that's a perfect example. And we're actually about to talk about that on the next couple of slides of the purchasing process and how can you build internal controls into your regular activities around purchasing. And so it sounds like, Barbara, you had a great example there of some of the fiscal controls that are in place at your organization. And I think that there's a lot to take from that in a positive way of putting those controls in to ensure that the items that you're receiving are appropriate, they're what you ordered, that they're being paid for appropriately. Yeah, the controls sound really, really strong there. It looks like there's another comment. We have a ceiling that various strata may have to refer to higher offices. There are costs that could be handled internally and costs where you may need external approvals depending on the ceilings. As per policy, our procurement is handled on the national. Yeah, and so that's perfect. So your organization may have some controls that put you in compliance with your national or the country that you're in, and you've got policies built around that. And it's quite common to see kind of the hierarchy of who can approve what type of order and dollar limits and who needs to get involved in approving. And in some cases, central offices need to get involved. If it's a capital item or the larger expenditures, as you can expect, more money being spent, more controls need to be in place around those types of expenditures. So yeah, I think that's a great point. It looks like we got a question. Someone's got their hand up.
Yeah, hi.
Hi.
Here in Mexico, we have to achieve or a guideline for like some IRS office. So first we need to follow our guideline inside the the institution, and then with this kind of IRS.
Mhm.
For example, we need to sign a lot of agreements between institutions, internal. So the question is, do we have to advise or notify to someone in NIH or our funding to in order to do all of that agreements?
Yeah, I'll defer to the game team on that.
That's a great question, Jimena. It may depend on what the agreement is. Generally, though, I'd say, if those agreements are necessary to do the work on the project, then they clearly need to move forward. And I don't know if they necessarily need a approval from the NIH unless it's constitutes an additional subcontract. It kind of depends on how the money flows. If that organization is getting paid and there's a subcontract involved, that may require some additional approval levels. But yeah, if there's something specific, feel free to email me and I'm happy to advise as best as I can.
Thank you.
I think you make a good point though about who can sign forms. And that's something that at VUMC or Vanderbilt, historically, we'd had some challenges around at a large organization. People were signing forms and entering the institution into agreements. And so that's something that had been handled at a department level for many years or decades. And over the last 5 years or so, we put in place a formal policy to put some more controls around that to limit the folks that could sign those agreements and incorporate that internal control into our daily practices of, I may have a manager or director title, but that doesn't mean I can enter Vanderbilt into a formal agreement with another organization. Only limited folks have that signature authority or that capability. Does somebody else have a comment or a question?
I think Betty was going to ask a question.
No, it's not. It wasn't a question. It was a contribution. So we do have segregation of duty, wherein you have an originating officer, then you have the finance team. In just an example, when we are raising payments or maybe probably requesting for payment, nobody's have monopoly over a transaction. It has to go through different people. You have the administrative team raising payments and requests. Then it has to go through the finance department, who confirms availability of funds and also trace those requests to the budget lines. And then once these documents have been prepared, which we have other corresponding documents that needs to be added or other people that needs to add their input before it's sent for approval. So nobody is a monopoly over any transactions. Nobody raised transactions, and from the initial stage to the end, it has to go through different sets of people and different sets of departments for you to complete each and every transaction irrespective of the amount, which shows a lot of transparencies, and also it shows also for me, I will say it's some amount of security, level of security to each project or each transaction.
Yeah, that's a wonderful example of having multiple departments involved in the purchasing process, not just even multiple people, but a different set of eyes, making sure you've got the money that's available. It's from a compliance perspective. You're maintaining that level of compliance, and then the research teams are getting the items that they need. So it's a win-win for everybody. So that's a wonderful example, Betty. Thank you for sharing. All right, so I'm going to transition out of internal controls and get into a little bit more of the job responsibilities that you may have. And I mentioned proactive financial management earlier. And I think this is an important concept for us, because this is, for many of us, we are reactive in the work that we do. We get an email, we get a call, we get a meeting on our calendar, we go to it, and now we're solving a problem. We're putting out a fire, we're taking care of a task that's in front of us. But if we can find ways to be proactive in the way that we manage our finances, for our US government awards, that will save us a good deal of time from an efficiency standpoint in the long run. So we've divided up these activities into a couple of categories: monthly practices, things that we suggest or recommend completing on a monthly basis, and then things that need to be accomplished on an annual basis. And some of these may be specific to VUMC. You could probably modify this list to meet your own institution's requirements. But there's definitely some overlap. And I think that there's value in keeping track of what you need to get done on a monthly basis or a more regular basis, and then those bigger things that have to be done once a year or once a quarter, whatever that time frame may be. And so for us, we think about our monthly practices being those departmental meetings where we can cover things like our effort communications. We spend more money on salary expenses than anything else. So we need to make sure that we're monitoring, tracking our effort plans in our systems, as well as the certification of effort, so that those salary expenses can be hitting at the appropriate rates and levels based off the work that's being performed. We also need to have a monthly general ledger reconciliation. So we're going to go through and review a financial report that's going to have detailed transactions so that we can verify that these are appropriate for our research projects. You may have invoicing that needs to be done. That's a topic that came up a little earlier. That's recommended on a monthly basis at our institution. Depends on the type of work and invoicing that you have, but it's something that you want to keep on your radar to make sure that you're staying on top of invoicing. When we think about annual practices at VUMC, this is things like the space survey, where we have to determine the amount of research space that we have at our institution. A good deal of work goes in to calculating that. We also have some annual negotiations with the US government for things like our indirect cost rate. And then we also have an annual audit at VUMC. So that process is quite extensive. And we have a team of folks that help support the research community should their projects be chosen to be part of that research audit that's being conducted for that year. In addition, there are some other activities that we've got down here at the bottom that come up sporadically throughout the year. Things like completing journal entries when corrections need to be made for your financial transactions, closing out of your awards, right? This doesn't happen on a fiscal year. It's typically on a project timeline, and those responsibilities can happen throughout the year. So whenever those come up, making sure that that's a priority and planning for that. At VUMC, we have a tool that we use, and we'll talk about this in a subsequent session. But it allows you to see what projects are closing out over the next 90 days, over the next 60 days. So you can start preparing before you get to that date of, okay, our project's ended and now we've got to wrap up our financial reporting and complete that sign off. You may also have things like cost transfers if you're moving money from one government project to another that need to be accompanied. So again, this is just an idea or strategy for you to organize or bucket your responsibilities that you have in managing your financial activities. I think that there's value in writing this down or typing it up and putting the plan in place. It's kind of like when you think about your own professional goals, what you hope to accomplish. So many of us are focused on the job that we have and the tasks that we have to get completed and the emails that we need to respond to. Very rarely do we take 15, 30 minutes to set aside some time to think about what our goals are and what steps we need to do to accomplish those goals. And so that little bit of planning from this perspective of what do I need to get done every month, right? And you can create your own small checklist of those tasks that need to be completed on a monthly basis. What are the annual things that we have coming? Perhaps there's some seasonality. We know every June is going to be a busy time at Vanderbilt because that's our year-end close. And so the finance world is going to be really busy. But perhaps there's some of that you can plan and prepare for in advance. And then what are those activities that come up throughout the year that when needed, they need your attention, in a very proactive way. Highly encourage you guys to put something together like this that meets the needs of the work and the responsibility that you have. you guys have touched on this, and I think you guys are probably experts when it comes to purchasing, because it's like you had my slide deck and you had reviewed it in advance. But when we think about purchasing and some best practices around this, we need to be mindful of restrictions that are in the award agreement. Yeah, it can be definitely, it can be spread out and across various areas or various organizations. You know, the timing of your responsibilities will most definitely change. Coming back to your award agreement, or if you're the subrecipient, working with your prime to understand the agreements and any sort of spend restrictions that you may have is critical. You want to ensure that you're including a detailed business purpose or business description. How is this particular research project going to benefit from this item? You know, what was the business purpose of that meal? Why were we traveling to this conference? You know, explaining that so that in the future, the terms that we use are when you win the lottery or when you no longer work at Vanderbilt and someone new is in your role, how will they be able to tell the story or understand what occurred years before with that travel report, right? That business purpose field is the telling of the story or explaining why that expenditure went to that particular project. You want to incorporate the three-way match when possible, and I'll illustrate this in my next slide, but you guys kind of touched on this already. The three-way match is an important internal control as part of the purchasing or the procurement process, and it's a good best practice to incorporate this in some fashion, and some great suggestions were shared earlier. And lastly, setting up a filing system. When we think about documentation, source documentation for reconciling the various transactions that you may have. You may have a system like the gentleman here on the bottom right, and I'm sure he can find whatever is asked of him, and he can has some method to that madness. But someday he's not going to be working at your institution, and somebody else is going to take over his office and going to have a really challenging time finding whatever documentation is on that desk. So coming up with a filing structure that's organized, that indexes, that can be easily understood by multiple people, right? So again, not limited to just one person's knowledge. Multiple people can be involved and understand the filing system, knowing that depending on your institution, sometimes the documents can be retained electronically. Sometimes they need to be kept in paper form. So wherever you fall in that spectrum, you could have a combination of the two, but an indexing system that both allows multiple people to have access to it. They understand the filing structure, and the documentation can be easily found and retrieved when needed, but also restrictive in that some of the documentation may be confidential in nature, right? So some of the documentation around your research projects could include things like salary information or salary expenditures that perhaps not everyone within your research team needs to see all of that information. So while you want it to be accessible by more than one person, you don't necessarily want it all to be accessible by everyone, if that makes sense. So just being mindful of that, whether it's paper or electronic forms, we are getting towards electronic being the preferred method at VUMC, but there are still some areas that prefer paper and have a kind of a hybrid combination of the two. And some awards require us to retain documentation in paper format. So it just depends on the agreements that you have with your sponsors. All right. So segregation of duties. It came up earlier in our conversation as well. I want to touch on this as an important internal control, right? When we think about segregation of duties, I think it was defined earlier in our session today, it's having more than one person involved in a business process, having more than one person involved as part of an internal control where there could be risk, right? So in this case, we're going to talk about the purchasing process. We're going to buy items, and this is a suggestion, the way that we recommend the internal control to be managed at VUMC, but knowing that your area may be different, staffing levels may be different and may not accommodate this. So I'll try to touch on some points where this could be modified or flexed somewhat. But the initial step is someone in your area initiates the transaction, right? However you go about purchasing items, at Vanderbilt, our preferred purchasing method is a tool called e-procurement. And so we describe it as it's like Amazon, where you can log in and you can buy just about anything in this online shop. So someone goes in and picks out what you're going to buy. And on the financial training team that I'm a part of, we love dogs. So we use them as an illustration purpose here on this slide to hit home, where we've got our friend here. It's like the husky who is logging into the computer and he is initiating the transaction. From there, we've got a second individual, a second employee who is going to approve the transaction, right? And several of you mentioned this. You may have a central office involved in review. You may have leadership involved. You may have both. Someone or multiple areas are approving the transaction. And this is when our friend, the lab comes in and says, yes, we can buy this. No, we shouldn't buy this. This is appropriate. That's not appropriate. From there, ideally you have a third person or a third team involved to take custody of the assets. And I think one of you mentioned this, that the items come into a central area and then they review the items that come in before they're dispersed. This is a really good best practice to have one individual or one department be in charge of taking control of the assets. So I'm going to have an example here of lab supplies. We're going to buy some gloves, and we ordered 6 boxes of gloves, size small, size medium, size large, and size extra large, right? So we're buying 6 boxes of each size. We should get 24 boxes of gloves. When you take custody of the assets and someone opens that box, they're going to see a packing slip, right? And a piece of paper that says, in this box, here's what we sent you. In that box, it may have your full order, 6 boxes of each size, so 24 boxes total, or it could have what's actually in the box, what was shipped. When we open the box, we see that we only had size medium and size large, and we're still waiting on the small and the extra large gloves. In that case, you want to verify or complete that 3-way match that we talked about earlier, where someone is verifying what's in the box, matches what's on the packing slip, and then what's on the packing slip matches what you actually ordered, right? So whether you have a purchase order system, some sort of procurement office, they can verify for you, and that's probably the intent behind having that control of them reviewing. But someone reviews, what did we actually order? It's great that these items showed up in our office, but did we order them? Is it what we ordered? Yes, it is. Wait a minute, we ordered 24 boxes and we only got 12 boxes. That's going to be an issue. And then you've got somebody taking custody of the assets. So in this case, ideally it's a third group, but this could be, if you're in a smaller area or smaller department, this could be the same employee that's initiating the transaction. So it could be that same first person, or it could be a third team member or third area of your institution. Once you've taken custody of the assets, somebody needs to reconcile the transaction, right? You're going to run a financial report to review what exactly were we charged? What exactly did we pay for? Did we pay for 12 boxes of gloves, or did we pay for 24 boxes that we ordered? Because they sent us an invoice for the full amount, but we only got 12 boxes in. Okay, so this is where our friend, the accounting beagle, comes into play to review those transactions line by line to verify what exactly was purchased. While it's recommended to have 4 people involved, you can have 3 people if you have the same person initiating the transaction and taking custody of the assets. And if you're in a very small area with very limited staffing, you could have the same person approve the transactions and reconcile the transactions. That's not the ideal format, but that can work if you're in a smaller area. So just things to be mindful of, that someone needs to verify what was ordered was what you actually received. And then someone else needs to verify what you actually paid for is what you actually received. And that gets very tricky, as one of you were mentioning, in the process of you buy the item, someone else approves it, it shows up to a different area or your research lab. And then the next thing you know, your finance person or yourself, you're reviewing the transactions in the month to verify, did we actually get this? And we're talking boxes of gloves that are used quite regularly in your research lab. So putting in place some internal controls, some best practices around this segregation of duties and this 3-way match process is highly recommended. All right, and so this, we like to try to bring a little bit of humor to our classes when we teach them. So this is a cartoon of where the segregation of duties could be very beneficial for this organization. It says, how does the staff take the news that you gave yourself another raise, right? You want to have more than one person involved in the all business processes, regardless of who they are and what their role is. So as an example, our CEO and president of our medical center has some controls in place at the institution where he may make decisions, but more than one person is involved in all of the business processes, whether that's somebody, a leader from HR, COO, some more than one person's involved in making these business decisions. All right, so reconciliation is an important internal control as well when we think about your financial responsibilities and what's being charged to your awards to the US government. You need to reconcile and review those transactions. We define reconciliation at Vanderbilt as consisting of these two things. You want to review your financial report and match the transactions on that report to source documentation, right? You need to see a copy of the receipts from the hotel on the travel report. You need to see a copy of the purchase order for the lab supplies that are being ordered. And then you need to verify that each transaction on that report is a legitimate business expense for your center. You need to go through and say, yes, this transaction should be charged to this award and it should be paid for by your institution. So at VUMC, we have lots of financial reports. This is just an example of one. There are indicators about the types of transactions, whether it's a P card or a procurement card, credit card transaction, if it's a check request, if it's a purchase order. Sometimes there's recurring charges for things like voicemail or telecommunications charges, those types of things. They'll show up on here, travel reports. All of these transactions show up. And as part of this monthly reconciliation, you're going line by line to verify, okay, this is an appropriate expense for our institution to pay for. It should be paid for by this research project. And I've got a copy of the itemized receipt or documentation to verify the nature of the transaction. All right. So things to consider when reviewing the charges or completing that reconciliation. Does the expense meet the direct charge guidelines? I think this is a topic that you'll get into in a subsequent session, but you want to make sure that the charge is appropriate based off the US government regulations. You want to verify that the charge has posted to the correct project or projects. Oftentimes we buy things and it may benefit multiple projects sharing the same research lab. So we need to make sure that expenditure is allocated to the appropriate projects. Is the charge being allocated or expensed to the appropriate account number? You should have some method within your accounting structure to track your expenses, to group them together. Is it a lab supply or is it a travel expense, right? However you all do that in your systems, make sure that the appropriate account or the appropriate expense grouping is being used and that you've got all of the supporting documentation needed for that item. And something that we see pretty regularly is things on travel reports. So think about if you've got somebody traveling on behalf of your research project, did they give you the itemized receipt from the meal, or did they just give you the portion of the receipt that has the total that they signed with the tip on it? You need to see the itemized portion so you can verify exactly what was purchased. Other things like conference registration is something that happens pretty regularly at Vanderbilt, where folks will register for a conference. The auto-generated email will then go to the participant going to the trip rather than the person buying, and they get many emails. So the receipt or the documentation needs to show proof of payment. It doesn't need to say, thank you for registering for this conference. We're so excited to have you. It needs to say, here's your receipt. We charged your Visa card for last four of your card or this for $250, right? It needs to show proof of payment. All right, so at VUMC, we identify a specific employee, a specific individual that we call the transaction review verification role. So this is a leader in each area of our institution that's responsible for reconciling all the transactions and signing off on the general ledger reports. This is a large, extensive process that's completed on a monthly basis. So the majority of the time, this is a team of people coming together, and our policy allows for that. So multiple people are involved in reconciling and reviewing the transactions, but ultimately one person, one individual within the administrative group of each area is responsible for signing off on those transactions. Okay, so we highly recommend having some structure where you've identified by name who's responsible for this. It just takes away any sort of ambiguity or uncertainty about whose role is this, who's responsible for it. You can have a backup. It's a good idea, probably best practice to have a backup. But ultimately, Mark's responsible for this, not Holly. Holly's going to help, but Mark's going to take care of this and sign off on it every month. And that's defined in our process. What questions do you have here before we move on? All right, I want to touch briefly on compliance levels. There's various levels of compliance that are important to be mindful of. We have U.S. government regulations that we need to maintain compliance for. We have perhaps sponsors' terms and conditions that could be more restrictive than the U.S. government that we need to be mindful of. Your institution can have policies or procedures, best practices that could fall under this compliance triangle, as well as your departmental policies and procedures. As you go up this triangle or this hierarchy, the policies or the restrictions should become more restrictive in nature. By that, I mean, you can't have an institutional policy that says, we'll reimburse 35 cents a mile if you're traveling, whatever the amount is. But we have a departmental policy that you'll get reimbursed $1 a mile, right? That you can't have a more lenient policy, but you can create more restrictive policies. So an example of that could be on the amount that you would reimburse for meals on a daily basis if someone's traveling. The institution may have a policy that says we'll reimburse $100 a day for meals, but the department says we'll only reimburse $75 a day, right? You can make it more restrictive. As you go up the pyramid, a way of thinking about this is you're getting increasingly more specific in nature. And this is important to us because when our transactions are reviewed, our financial transactions are reviewed by either external or internal auditors, and they're judging the compliance or the proprietary of the transactions themselves, they are going to look at your rules that you have in place. The US government may have rules in place, but if you have an institutional policy that's more restrictive, they're going to expect and hold you to that institutional policy that's more restrictive. That's what they're going to review. That's the standard they're looking for. If you have a departmental policy that's even more restrictive, they're going to hold you to that more restrictive departmental policy. At VUMC, we have central offices that provide guidance and support, help interpret these federal regulations and guidelines. And I think it is a good best practice to utilize and understand the support and resources that you have available at your institution. Leverage those. I think at Vanderbilt, it's something that we could probably do a little better job of, understanding what all is out there and what departments we have to help support our research community. So taking advantage of those is an important piece. Looks like we got 15 minutes. So any questions here so far? All right, so I have an activity for us, and we're going to go quickly through this activity. I want us to get a chance to do this. I'm going to drop it in the chat so everyone can get to this link. And so while you guys are logging into this, it's called Jamboard. It's a tool that is created by Google, and it's part of Google's suite of applications that they have. And I'm going to bring over my Jamboard so I can get us used to it. Okay. Has anyone ever used Jamboard? You guys familiar with this? No. All right.
No.
Okay. So just basic navigation. There are several slides up at the top. So we got 6 slides. As you go across, I see folks are joining up here, so that's good. Keep clicking in. I want to see that number go up a little bit. I'm not sure how many folks we have, but we're going to send you all to breakout rooms. You're going to have a scenario based off of the number of your breakout room. And we're probably only going to have time to get to one, but the way you handle is you can read your scenario as a group, and then you can share your ideas on how you would answer the specific scenario that you have. So the ways that you can answer are using sticky notes. So over on the left-hand side, there's a sticky note. You just click that. You can change the color of your sticky note and you just start typing. And then from there, you can move your sticky note around just by clicking it and dragging. You can also insert pictures. If you'd like to illustrate your responses in that manner, the way you do that is just do the add image, and then you can click Google image search, and you can search for an image for how you would handle the scenario, or you can simply type on the screen, and the way you do that is the text box down here at the bottom left. You can drag that, and then you just start typing. And again, you can resize and position as needed. So we're going to divide you up into 4 groups. If you're group 1, you're going to take scenario 1. If you're group 2, scenario 2, and so on. And then we'll spend just a couple minutes, 6 minutes or so out there in the groups. We'll come back and then we'll report out for a couple of the groups on how you handle the scenarios, because we're running short on time here. Okay. So is somebody able to set up the breakout rooms?
Yep, I'm doing it now. So pay attention to your room number, and your room number will match the scenario that you complete.
So my name is Vanessa Dupree, and I actually head up the Senior Manager Chorus Management Office. And today I'm just going to discuss with you how Wits Health actually manages their indirect cost, because I know that we're different. So we're based in South Africa, and I know that we actually are a sub-recipient of Vanderbilt, and we're also a prime of Vanderbilt. So we have this two-way contract, and the way our indirect is managed is very different to a lot of other people, I'm sure, but it's how we have to manage it for ourselves. So just to give you an overview of Wits Health Consortium, the University of Witwatersrand is 100% shareholder of the Wits Health Consortium. So we are a private company that we've registered ourselves as, but we actually manage all our own income and everything that goes through our company, including all the finances around our research. We were registered in 1997, so we've been running for quite a few years now. And basically, Wits Health Consortium was established as the legal entity that the Faculty of Health Sciences can actually conduct their externally funded research through us, so that they weren't restricted, because what we found is that a lot of the universities, with a lot of their policies and controls that they have, an example is if they wanted to procure something, it could take between 3 and 6 months to procure an item if they needed it for their lab. At Wits Health, they have a little bit more leeway where we can procure something within 24 to 48 hours, and we have special controls in place, and there's a lot of policies to ensure this happens, but it just manages how things can turn around quicker for the researchers. So that's how Wits Health Consortium was set up in 1997 to assist these people. So the governance structure is basically, we have a board of directors that are accountable for everything. There, under the board of directors, we have a whole lot of subcommittees. So you've got your risk and audit committee, we've got our remuneration committee, and the strategy and investment committee, an academic oversight committee, the social and ethics committee, and then directors affairs committee. And each of these committees, they have written terms of reference, and they all have to report back at the scheduled board meetings, which we have twice a year. So everyone comes together and the board actually controls everything of how we are managed.
Vanessa, your slides aren't advancing. So
Oh,
I'm
aren't
not sure
they?
if you're intending, yeah, they must be stuck.
Oh,
Might want to share, unshare, and then share again, perhaps.
let me try that. Okay, thank you.
I was also wondering because it seemed like I could see an introduction slide on the side. So thank you for saying.
Sorry. Let me try this. Okay, can you see that?
Yes, we can see the title slide. Mhm.
Okay, is it moving on
Perfect.
now?
Perfect. Mhm.
Is it moving on now?
Yes,
Okay.
thanks.
All right, thank you. Sorry about that. Okay, so I explained the substructures and the governance structure. So then just to give you some idea of the experience in these last 25 years, basically we manage in excess of 300 active grants or contracts every year. So there's basically 120 new contracts that we get annually. And they total approximately $100 million each year. So currently last year, we closed our books on 2.2 million ZAR, South African rands. That's sort of what we did for our research last year. And then we have approximately 5,000 staff members that support what we do. So let me move on. All right, so the primary role is to provide the governance and legal framework, human resource management, financial and grants management for the university research entities. So Wits Health Consortium, being the private company, is the legal entity. And then what we've done is that we have structured it so that we have various researchers operating under us as divisions. So each of them, we have approximately 900 bank accounts, which we manage, and each of them is a separate division, or one division can have.
Oh my God. Wow.
Said the same thing.
It's quite big. We've definitely grown. So basically, one division can also have approximately 20 bank accounts if they've got different projects running through them. So just to give you an idea of what we're managing and how it's set up. So what we've done is we've created a shared service center, because one of our challenges going back to when we first started was that we were entitled to our indirect cost, but how did we actually account for it? And how did we actually show the auditors how it was made up? Because we weren't doing the reporting, we weren't doing the projects, but yet we were facilitating the services. So how did we actually accommodate that? And that was something that it's taken us quite a while to actually perfect and rectify. So we created a shared service division within Wits Health Consortium. And what we do is that this division is set up with all Wits Health internal staff, core staff, and we manage the grant side and the financial oversight of all of the contracts that we receive through Wits Health Consortium. So we provide key components of well-governed administration to the PI. So we do all the administration, all the financial, all the human resources. We have payroll, legal, and regulatory support. So we offer all of that to them to manage their funding and their projects and their contracts that we manage. Are there any questions so far? I hope I'm not going too quickly. Okay, I'm going to take that as a no. All right, so our admin fee. So this is the reason why I was asked to present today around Wits Health. So we are responsible for the administration of all these sponsored activities. And we include all the compliance around it and manage all of that in respect to all the donor rules and the South African laws that apply to us. So we have to make sure that we bring all of that together. So the admin and fiscal management fee charged by Wits Health in respect of our services provided is 10% of direct costs. So we build that into all of our budgets before they're submitted. For NIH, though, we are only entitled to a ceiling of 8% of an indirect cost. So that's all we can build in on an NIH grant when we put the budgets together, when we are preparing the NIH applications. Okay, to give you just an idea, so unpack the direct costs. So these costs that can be identified specifically with a particular final cost objective, such as your project or other internally or externally funded activity that is directly assigned to the project. So those are your direct costs, which I'm sure you're aware of. It's like your salaries, your travel, your office costs, any lab equipment, consumables, anything like that. That's built into your direct cost. Okay, then we go through to the indirect costs. So this is where we apply a fee. So you take the budget and you take your full direct costs. And then on that, we apply either the 8 or the 10%, depending on which sponsor it is. And the indirect costs are basically the portion of costs incurred by Wits Health as our general overhead and admin expenses, and it's shared across all these programs. So these expenses are not incurred for the benefit of the project and aren't reasonably assigned to the benefiting projects. So this is just the support that we offer on these projects, and they can't be allocated as a direct cost. So these the indirect expenses are allowable costs incurred for the overall benefit and prudent operation of Wits Health Consortium. So these indirect costs are included in the indirect, we have an indirect expense pool that are allocated. And so when we actually do our calculation, we combine all of these costs into an overall spreadsheet to be able to work out the calculation of what our costing would be on all of our US projects. Just for information, we are still currently working on a NICRA as well, which we've been working on for the last 2 years, and it hasn't been approved as yet. So we're still waiting for our NICRA approval. So the modified total direct cost method specified in that 2CFR 200 is used to calculate the indirect expense rates in accordance with the NICRA and the provisions of the US government agreements. So we do apply that method when we are doing it. The allocation basis for the indirect costs, so we have a single indirect expense pool, as I explained earlier, which is allocated to the final cost objectives using the simplified allocation method. So those are just where you could go and read it. So this is built into our actual indirect cost policy. So these are just some of the things I've just brought in to show you. So travel costs can be a bit of challenging. So travel costs may be charged as either direct or indirect, depending on the purpose of the trip. So that's where we sit with the project, the PI, and we work out, is it project specific, or would it be a core cost where we would be included in traveling, where I might have to go to a site and do an audit or something like that. And then we look at it to see, is it specific to the project, or is it a core cost that we will include in the indirect cost? So we have to actually analyze each of these costs individually, as Mark said earlier, we really have to analyze it to decide how it works and where it sits when we actually do our indirect calculation. Okay, so mixed charges. So employees that support both direct and indirect activities have their cost of employment split between direct and indirect. And one of those is like your timesheet. We have an electronic timesheet, and we have to allocate the time spent on, is it project related, or is it a core overhead cost related? And that's we have to do every month. I'm sure all of you also do that, so that we can actually depict, is it a employee that is project related, so we can claim it on the project, or can we actually bill it in our indirect cost? So all of this is audited. And as Mark also said, yeah, we also get audited annually. We have quite a few audits that are run through us, between grant audits, statutory audits. It just continues. So we are constantly being audited. So we have to ensure that all of these indirect costs are actually recorded accurately and correctly. So rental expenses for Wits Health core staff is charged as an indirect cost. So that's our building that we sit in Joburg. Any rental expenses on space that is depicted for the project is charged as a direct cost to the project. Supplies and materials used by staff members who engage in indirect costs are charged on an indirect cost basis as well, because that's another thing we have to analyze to make sure that it's being allocated correctly. All our IT costs for Wits Health at the core office are all charged as indirect costs, because we can't allocate that to a project. It's for us to actually be sustainable. And these are just some of the general expenses that we have that we are covering in the indirect costs when we do our calculations, just to give you an idea of what we actually build into our massive spreadsheets when we're actually doing our calculation to create our indirect cost, because we have to validate it every year. All right, that was my presentation. I hope that I didn't run too quickly through that for you.
Thanks,
And I hope-
Vanessa. It looks like Constance has a question in the chat. She says, does your FNA cover all of your indirect expenses, or do you have an over or under?
We actually do cover all our indirect expenses. So we, at the end of the day, what we do is we pull all of the costs that we have incurred for that year, and we actually analyze it to make sure. So like all of the CEO, all the executive salaries, my whole department salaries, because of the chorus management of what we do, we incorporate all of that in this pool, and then we actually break it out, and we have to extract any costs that aren't allowable there to create a baseline, and then from there we create the calculation. Did that answer the question? Sorry.
Another question.
Yes.
So where are you paid from?
I'm
Are you
paid
paid
from
from
core.
the direct cost or indirect cost?
No, I'm paid
Or
from
the
the
services
indirect
you
cost.
provide?
Yes, I'm part of its Health Consortium core staff, and I'm paid from the indirect.
Hello?
Yes,
So
hi.
there's I didn't see something under the traveling cost. For example, you do have people that work on a percentage basis of their time on certain projects. So let's say they are traveling out of the country, and then their per diem or other allowances paid to them is higher than what is accepted by that particular project. For us, for example, the difference will be paid from the overhead. But because for you, you mentioned that all costs relating to the particular project should be charged on the direct cost.
Correct.
For those who have excess amount above what is actually accepted for that particular project, are you still going to charge those excess amounts to that project?
No, we
Or
don't.
would
We
you
only
have to
charge the
do it?
amount allowed.
Okay.
I think my question is a bit of a general question,
Okay.
and not to years. So what I want to understand is for direct costs, for example, like USAID does not sponsor the building construction costs. So and they only do refurbishing and stuff. So in events where you have an indirect cost of 10, let's say 8%, and you on your overall you have some funds for indirect from the same USAID, is it possible to use that indirect cost to sponsor construction costs? Or for another example could be seeking prior approval for purchasing a vehicle that is not US made, and you have to seek prior approval to get that vehicle purchased. But if, let's say for instance, you have a pool of indirect costs from 3 or 4 USAID grants, and then you want to purchase a vehicle that can be used for core activities for cost cut across other departments. And is it also advisable to seek approval to get that vehicle, bearing in mind that the cost for the vehicle is from a pool fund from various USAID grants that you receive?
An example from our side is that if we were procuring a motor vehicle, we would build it into a direct cost. So we would get the NIH or USAID approval upfront when we were actually budgeting for the project. On construction, we normally don't do construction because we've already been set up and we have our sites that are already active and are working from those sites. So really the only assets we really do procure is the motor vehicles and any lab equipment.
I can
Maybe-
jump there
yeah.
on that though, just to add that if there is a certain funding restriction for using that might say federal funds can't be used in a certain way, for example, construction, that does also apply to the indirect cost coverage. So like your question, Barbara, about can you use indirect costs for construction? It's my understanding that no, if USAID doesn't allow that for federal funds, that also applies to how you're using those federal funds with your indirect expenses. But you do always have the ability to reach out to your grant management specialists to ask these questions just to see. Sometimes there's some flexibility, like for NIH grants, we've had issues where the team wanted to purchase an air conditioning unit, and it was a little unclear if that was an allowable or unallowable cost. And it was allowable as an indirect cost. So that's one example, where you could reach out. And I think similarly with the vehicle purchase, we have, and in the past on another project that I supported, purchased vehicles that were going to be supporting various projects. But we did still have to get that approval to purchase a non-US vehicle, because it's those federal funds being used in that way. So you still have to be compliant with the regulations like the Fly America Act and purchasing US vehicles, or at least justify that you couldn't access. They will approve purchasing non-US vehicles. There's just a process that you have to go through to get that approval, which I know you're aware of, Barbara.
Yeah, thanks, Anna. I just want to be clear about that. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Got it. Okay.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yes, in instances where they are overspent, does the sponsor have the authority to, or can you use your your overheads to cover the overspent?
You see, we if we have any overspend or anything related to that, that's project related to the different projects. For Wits Health Consortium Core, we don't actually we don't build our cost into the project. It's just we catch the indirect amount of the direct budget is all that we can move to support what Wits Health does. So we don't have an overspend or an underspend as such, because we just do the calculation each year to prove that that is our percentage that we're allowed as per what the USAID is allowing us.
Great, thank you everyone this is a great discussion, Vanessa. It's wonderful to have you join us, and thank you so much for all your insights. It's a perspective that we don't have. Vanderbilt charges indirect costs, and it's kind of a mystery of where all that money goes. We're project staff, and it's great to hear project staff in different areas talk about how they use these funds. So I appreciate it.
Super. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, great. Well, everyone, we are at the end of our class today. It was so packed. We will try and be a little bit more mindful of time, make sure that we can get through our activities in our next sessions, and we will see you all next week for class 2. If there's any pre-class activities, we will send an email reminding you to complete those, and then we'll post all of the class materials today on our website, and I'll also send a notice once those get posted. All right, if anyone needs to stay on or has a question or issue, I can stay on for a few minutes. Otherwise, we'll see you next week.
Thank you so much. Goodbye.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thanks everybody.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye for all the
Bye.
Thank you very much, everyone. Bye.
Bye. Have a good evening, afternoon.
Yeah. Thank you, Anne.
Bye-bye.
Doesn't seem like anyone has any burning issues or questions, so I think I will end this session, and thanks.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.